I think we'll start. I think people will slowly be arriving here, and we have some in-person activities are starting after this virtual tour. But I'll say good morning formally to our guests here in person and our guests on the Zoom webinar. And thank you very much for joining us. And I mentioned earlier that this symposium kicked off last night, Friday, with a reception and a concert. And today we have a full day of papers, interrupted by a concert midday, and then this day will close with another concert, and then the symposium will formally be done tomorrow midday after we have a workshop for music students here. So I'd like to begin by welcoming Andrej from the Tartini house in Piran. We've seen each other a few times now over Zoom, and you've been part of this, part of the planning and part of this little project here in Edmonton from the start. So, and thank you very much for offering to do this and for being willing to start the day for us. So I'll turn it over to you, if I may.
Okay, of course. So hello to everybody. My name is Andrej, my surname Rojec. I am Slovenian. I came from the city of Portorož. I live near Piran, and I usually present Tartini's house when visitors wanted to know something, mostly new things that are not written in the house. And so I would like to read you something about something that wrote Francesco Fanzago, director of the public schools of Padua, at the beginning of his eulogy, given the day after the Master of Nations' departure. And he wrote, "The greatness of his talents, his vast knowledge, and his incomparable merit had made him so renowned and famous throughout the world that even the most cultured nations yearned to possess him, but he chose our Padua as his home, having lived here for 10 lustri, that means 5 years, with such decorum and with such glory." And so what we feel in Piran? We feel in Piran that Tartini is for sure a leading figure whose work and more generally overall legacy are only partially known to specialists, and yet he remains quite unknown to the wider public. Just a second. Okay. So after the Second World War, the Italian Cultural Circle was founded in Pirano, and it had the aim of spreading popular culture. The Italian culture circles in 1971 were then reorganized and became something like a community that carried out quite extensive social, artistic, cultural, political activities. At that time, Casa Tartini was completely restored as part of some Italian-Yugoslavian collaboration, and thanks to the, actually it was 100% of contribution by the Italian government. In 2001, Casa Tartini was assigned to the Italian community. The latter had just been registered in the Register of Associations as required by the legislation of the Republic of Slovenia. The last renovation took place in 1219, thanks to the Tartini Cultural Tourism under the banner of Giuseppe Tartini project that was co-financed by the Interreg Italy-Slovenia program. Thanks to the funds, Casa Tartini now hosts a museum itinerary dedicated to the great son of the city of Pirano. The project wanted to emphasize the cultural and historical heritage of which the Italian community feels like its guardian. The project partnership had the municipality of Pirano as leader, and so a very nice collaboration between Italian and Slovenian entities. The community of the Italians of Pirano, which I'm speaking for now, the Ljubljana Festival, the Giuseppe Tartini Conservatorio of Trieste, the University of Padua, and the Central European Initiative Secretariat from Trieste. The goal of this project was to enhance and actually to enhance the cultural heritage of Giuseppe Tartini, and to do it so in the border area and even beyond. And among the results of the project, in addition to the renovation to Casa Tartini, which now is a multifunctional building, we have also a multimedia path dedicated to the historical evolution of the building, and of course some wall paintings, but also workshops of let's say ceramic, painting, drawing, a little music school. We host many events, conferences, debates, and there is an important result that should be pointed out. It's Discover Tartini. It's a website that somehow still contributes to making Tartini's work accessible all around the world. It contains a virtual itinerary which offers scholars, enthusiasts, and tourists free access to Tartini musical, literary, and exhibition heritage. Okay. Some other results are the Tartini 250, 251, and 330 projects that were actually promoted by the ex-president of the community. Now she is the vice mayor of Piran, and we really managed to make very important new partnership by, of course, only voluntary work because the community has no employee, and by taking care for interpersonal relationships. These were actually very strong points because everybody then was willing to somehow help us. Look, this is also interesting. After the unveiling of the monument of Giuseppe Tartini, so this was in 1896, one of the biggest concerts that took place in Piran was only in 1992 when played Uto Ugi, Maestro Uto Ugi. And then till 2016, Tartini was somehow like forgotten for the city. And via this Interreg project, we managed to bring to Pirano the Solisti Veneti. You can see this picture in the middle. That it was a concert that was really full of people. Then by this project, Tartini 250, 251, also the tourism office of the municipality somehow started to help us. And so in this year, we had this, for us, very big project that is called Tartini 330. And we have a very nice brochure and a very big partnership. We have actually 50 partners, and also the government of the Republic of Slovenia declared 2022 Tartinians year in the field of culture. What we did with this kind of collaboration is, okay, very interesting concerts, like we have here on the left Shushan Siranasyan that played on Tartini's violin. This is her picture in Tartini's theater in Piran with his violin. Of course, Stefan Milenkovic, that is quite known, and we had a very good attendance in the auditorium that can host 1,400 people. But we also brought Tartini to Istria, to Croatia, to Fiume, and to Pola. And on the right, you can see this very nice collaboration with the Conservatory of Music of Trieste. via the help of their Baroque ensemble of their students, we managed to involve our students, young people, and everybody was really delighted. So, since we have to talk about Tartini's house, I think that now I should somehow start this guided tour. Um, the interesting thing, in my opinion, is that I start the tour outside of Tartini's house. I always ask people if they are for a walk, and we take a 100-meter walk, and we begin this tour under the first line of the walls that several centuries ago surrounded the oldest part of the city. Actually, Pirano has had 3 wall lines, and the ones on the hill that you probably have seen in the pictures on the internet are the newest one. So people coming to Pirano are quite surprised because when in the middle of the old city, as they feel it, I am telling them that this is one of the oldest and most important city doors, a gate at the eastern end of the town. And look, you can see here, maybe I don't know if it's readable, the name of this door. It's called Porta Campo. That means the door of the field. Well, we don't know exactly how Pirano looked at that time, but we do know that outside of this door, there were meadows for grazing goats, some olive groves, vineyards. And from a sketch of Pietro Nobile, we know that there was a very small church, and the water under the Baroque house, I will tell you then by looking another picture. But above all, what we know is that there was a space that was used to call citizens to hear the news on what will be resolved in the municipality. This open space in some history books is called Platea Communis, and this is the real connection with the door's name. And another interesting thing is the upper part of the wall. There was a church, the Church of St. James, where the members of the council prayed to be able to make the right decision. Wishing masses were celebrated to be helped by the Lord, the Virgin, and of course the protector of Piran, St. George. Now we have a picture of this square, Tartini Square. It has been taken like 1 hour ago. In Piran is raining, and as I told you before, on the right you can see I don't know if you see my pointer. I hope so. On the right you can see the Baroque house, and so you must imagine that the sea was going till here, till the Baroque house. This is a church that once upon a time was very, very small. This is Tartini's house. And the Porta Campo is actually behind this building here that today hosts the coastal galleries. And so it's pretty interesting to understand that you're going out of the city. The present neoclassical exterior of the building dates from the 19th century, and since 1846 has been adorned with a memorial to Giuseppe Tartini on the facade. I took yesterday a zoom picture. It's here on the right. And this epigraph was affixed here 176 years ago. And what I like to point out is that it has a significant mistake. I don't know if it's readable, but on the right side, in the second line, I know by memory what's written. It's written a Giuseppe Tartini, nato in questa casa, il, and then there is this Roman number. And the Roman number states that Tartini was born on the 12th of April. And actually, I don't know exactly when the discovery of the exact date of Giuseppe Tartini baptism was made, but we believe it was about 50 or more years ago when the baptismal book was still in the baptistery in Pirano. And given the vicissitudes of Giuseppe Tartini's family, we think that Giuseppe was baptized almost immediately after his birth. And so we take the 8th of April as his birthday, but we still are not sure. Okay, Casa Tartini has recently welcomed the museum trail, as I told you, and the Giuseppe Tartini's museum collection. And we now have some multimedia support and technology so that popular content and information can be given very easily to people willing to visit Tartini's house. For today, I took some interesting texts from a work that has been made by the Centro Italiano Carlo Combi. They made an effort to study, present, and disseminate the historical and cultural heritage of the Enlightenment. And I think that we can take some really interesting information about Tartini and his family through this work. While Tartini was actually acclaimed during his lifetime, they told that he was the first violinist of Europe. His biography, particularly the part regarding his youth, is actually has very many several gray areas. And for this reason, initiatives like this weekend's Tartini Symposium are extremely useful. And I really wanted to thank Professor Carpenter, the Embassy of Slovenia in Canada, for inviting us, and of course, everybody who's attending this presentation. So, let's try to enter Tartini house via picture. Okay, here we are at the entrance. On the left side, you can see how it's looking in this very precise moment. Tartini's house, it's closed due to bad weather and somebody missing who had to work. But when you enter the house, you see these three recipients that were used for storing olive oil. And actually on the right side, you can see the stairs, and in one side they are quite steep, and on the other side, even if this picture doesn't show very well this thing, they are not so steep. So it's actually like a sign that something was going on with this house, that this house has changed during the time. Okay, this is our reception, and you actually start the museum route here, and on the left side of the wall you have some pictures that that somehow represent what was going on the 2nd of August 1896. This was like 2 years after Tartini Square was made a square, because before we have this Mandraccio, the port. And it was actually a very big party, a big feast that took place from the morning till the evening and ending with fireworks, and everything was made actually for the 200th anniversary of his birth, but they were late. They were actually 4 years late, and even some days more than these 4 years, and they were late because they started to collect money for the monument, and they had very big problems in collecting money. And actually, under the monument, it's written a Giuseppe Tartini Listria. That means that wasn't only Piran who gave money for this monument, but it was all the Istria. By memory, I think there were 19 municipalities who gave money for this monument, and also the Conservatory of Music and some other groups of people. And by going on, going through this door, we came to a part of Tartini house where we have a genealogical tree, how it's said. And here we can clearly see that Giuseppe Tartini was the fourth of 6 children that has been born to Giovanni Antonio Tartini, his father, who was a merchant from Florence and who came in Pirano in 1678. And of Caterina Zangrando, who was from an old and very important Pirano family. And as you can see, I started the tour under this Porta Campo, and at that time, Casa Tartini wasn't Casa Tartini. It was mentioned for the first time in 1384, and it was mentioned as Casa Pizzagrua. And this Casa Pizzagrua was very, very small, like only the entrance and the first floor, or maybe one room more and its first floor. You have to know that at the time there was no concept of like a palace, if you can understand. All buildings were extremely functional, small enough to host what they had to host, so that they can easily make them hot enough to live inside. And you know, it was just a very, very, very different concept. Okay, the Zangrando family was, as I said, one of the oldest in Pirano, and its name was a combination of the name Zuane and the adjective grando, big. Also grosso is documented. And the name of the mother's side of the violinist family is derived from Zuane Zangrando, who was born in 1550 and married a certain Maria, from whose union 4 boys and as many girls were born. Giovanni Antonio Tartini, on the other side, was born in Florence. We don't know when for sure, but it was between 1648 and 1649. And we don't know exactly what brought him to Piran, to Istria, but we know that he was a merchant and that he obtained Pirano citizenship around 1678 or 79. His business was a really flourishing one. He also owned salt pans in Strugnano, and during his life, he increased his property ownership throughout important purchases. The most notable are the land in near Umago. This is on the other side of the Gulf of Piran when you're looking south, actually from Salvore to Umago, so quite a big land. And the elevation of his social position was really remarkable, and in the 1690s even accelerated. Particularly important was his appointment as public writer or public scribe of the souls. This was actually, he was the director of the salt pans, and this was a really prestigious position, which supervised the quality and quantity of the product. And it was a position that was that depended by the magistrate of the Republic of Venice. We need to point out that Piran salt, so this from the salt pans of Sicciole, Strugnano, and Santa Lucia, was actually known as the best salt in the whole Adriatic Sea. So it was even more special, this his position. And it's very interesting if you see on this genealogical tree that his son Giovanni Antonio, I'm sorry, Domenico, also became in this position, also became the public writer of the Souls, even if this wasn't a transferable position, if you understand. So this also speaks about the power of Giovanni Antonio Tartini. They married in Pirano in 1685, and they had many children. And the second Pietro, the first Pietro, and Anna, they all died prematurely the same year that they were born. So the composer father Giovanni Antonio passed away between November 1709, and the circumstances in which he passed away are still unknown, but we speak about a possible murder. And on March 1699, Giovanni Antonio Tartini was appointed as administrator, superintendent, and procurator of the Minorite monastery in St. Francis in Pirano. And this position actually gave him the right to be buried inside the sacred building by the guardian Giovanni Pitacco. So the family tomb, I can show you this picture, the family tomb formerly belonged to the Petronio family, is now located in the middle of the nave of St. Francis Church in Piran. It's really near Tartini's house. It's like 1 minute walk to there. And in 1992, on the 300th anniversary of the violinist's birth, the Friars Minor somehow highlighted this tomb, and the tomb is the original one, but it has been unmarked for centuries. Okay, here we are in the room of the vedutas, and the interesting things are this arch on the left side, that is a Gothic arch. Then we have a pond, and then on the right you can see the door and the face on the door. So we now know that really Tartini's house was being expanding during time. If you see on the right, you can see the old, this right picture that is vertical. On the left side, you can see the old Gothic house. And then you see a black part of the building. And this black part of the building is actually now inside the house, you see, where the water was stored. And yes, okay, and I said on the arch of the door, the head. So this door that we see in the center of the picture actually could have been the main entrance door. Okay, I said that Tartini's birthplace is now a cultural monument. It's a cultural monument of the bourgeoisie architecture, and it's the property and the seat of the Italian community that has the name Giuseppe Tartini of Pirano, yes. And we use this building for various cultural activities, as I told you before, for conferences. And the most important thing in the last time is that we are also hosting and making guided visits. And so we are quite good in doing so. And now Casa Tartini has become also a palace that is used for protocol meetings. And yes, so you have to imagine that all the new building somehow stands on the site of this 14th century Gothic Casa Pizzagrua. And that we are very near the St. Peter's Church. And that once all these houses were located near a harbor. And what you can see today mostly has been rebuilt and repaired, and it had been they did so several times, and mostly during the ownership of this wealthy family, this Zangrando family. For instance, if we are speaking or seeing the paintings on the walls, there were many layers of other paintings, and then the restorator chose this as the most significant paintings. Um, you know, this Domenico, so one of the son of Antonio Tartini, actually brought from Venice graphic works by the famous engraver and vedutist Pietro Gaspari. So these pictures that we are seeing here are from Pietro Gaspari. But in the small room, we have also some paints of Giambattista Tiepolo. Of course, they are not original, but this was the fashion of the time. Okay, I said under this Gothic arc, we have here a cistern with a fountain, and it's dated 1821. It's actually the date of the major construction work that is still preserved. And you have to imagine this was outside of this house. Okay, going on, we have an interesting picture. Now, please take a look at this wall painting on the right. You can see there is on the extremely right, there is a fantasy building, so something that wasn't here at the time when when this was painted. But we are here located in Strunjan, from the northern side of Strunjan and looking to the south. And what we are seeing, actually in this picture, it's quite difficult to see this, but we are seeing the valley of Strunjan, and we see here a little house that was built for the workers of Antonio Tartini, and then a little church, Chiesa di San Basso. And what's missing on the left, it's missing the Tartini's villa. They actually brought something like 45,000 square meters of land, and they planted olive trees, and they made this villa and so on. They used this house for the summer. On the right side of this painting, there is something like a fishery pond. They have also the production of fish. Yeah, it's very interesting. And I can show you this picture. And this is actually how Villa Tartini looked before it was put down, destroyed after Second World War II. Now Villa Tartini has this name, but it's nothing like the old Tartini's house. This was a choice of the protocol. Here you can see the room with architectural capricci. So this picture on the center on the right is Tiepolo's picture, and as I told you before, Pietro Nobile. You see on the left and on the right the paintings are missing, and this was quite an interesting story that has been told to me by the lady who was supervising the restorator works, and she told me that she came one day there and they were destroying everything with hammers, and then that she started screaming and stopping the works and so on. And so actually she was the one that stopped this destruction of old paintings, and now today we can admire them. And here on the lower side, we have the tail. Okay, the plant, I don't know the name in English. We call them in Italian acanto. And the fruit maybe could be maybe the cocoa fruit. And actually, this was painted when Giuseppe Tartini was alive, but I don't know if they knew in Piran how he was using much of his money for cocoa. I don't know if you know the story about this thing, but in the archives of the discovered Tartini, I found a letter, and in a letter there is interesting data about how much money Giuseppe Tartini spent for cocoa, for chocolate, for drinking chocolate, and it's quite remarkable because I think it's something around 20% of all what he earned during his lifetime. Okay, if we go up to the house, we can enter this memorial room that has on the walls some interesting informations. You see on the right also this post-mortem mask. And I took the picture for some interesting documents, at least in my opinion, but interesting maybe not for you who are now hearing me, but for the tourists and the people that are interested in Tartini who come in this house. The left one is the testamento. I don't know in English the name. So when you die, you write to whom you are giving your things, your belongings. And in this testamento, we have twice. It's written. Okay, Tartini actually somehow wants to give to everybody in the same parts all the things, but he writes escluse sempre le femmine, and then at the end one more time escluse sempre le femmine. So to ladies, to women, nothing. In the center, okay, here the pictures are not good, but one when comes in the house and sees these texts, it's very clear that Tartini had a very interesting calligraphy and very dense. And here we can introduce people to the different things about Tartini that they don't know. So that he was also a man of science, also a philosopher, and so on. And people are really interested in this thing. And on the right, I took a picture of the other side of the wall, and here is written Tartini self manuscript with special, I don't know, special notes. Yes. And the interesting fact is that they actually made the picture with this drop shadow from the left and the upper side to the right and down. Yes. And this drop shadow actually doesn't help very much visitors to understand what's written here, because the point of this picture is the writings that are on the upper side. You see, when Tartini used this cryptographic alphabet, for the poems that he used to inspire himself when writing music. Okay, I'm quite late. So the visit of Tartini house goes on. Now we have some pictures of the second floor. And in the second floor, we dedicated some part of the house to Cesare dell'Acqua, who was another important man of culture. He was actually a painter that was born 201 years ago in Piran, and that in Slovenia is practically forgotten. On the other side of the sea, we have the Castello of Miramare that is made from white stone, and it can be easily seen from Piran. And this is from Trieste going to the west. And the Castle of Miramare is full of his paintings. Also, the municipality building of Trieste, its biggest picture in the most important room is from Cesare dell'Acqua. But in Slovenia, nobody knows that Cesare dell'Acqua was actually born in Piran. And we are fighting for now more than 30 years to put a stone, a table on his birth house, and we still haven't managed to do so. We have also an interesting story about the paint. This is actually Slovenian people or Slovenian associations owns only two paintings of Cesare dell'Acqua, and one is hosted in Tartini's house. We didn't have the money to buy it, but we asked the man who was selling it at the auction if he would be interested in in giving us this painting, and he actually gave us this painting, and so we now fulfill um, his volonté. I don't find the word, I'm sorry. And we are telling this story to people who comes to visit Casa Tartini. The room on the left side down is called Sala Stagioni, so the room of the seasons. And there are preserved only two seasons. The other went lost. And the room on the right is Sala Incensieri, that I really can't translate in English, I'm sorry. And on the upper side, I made a picture of what you can see outside of the window of this room, so you can understand how important was this place in Piran. Okay, since the time is going very, very fast, I wanted to tell you something about Tartini's violin, but maybe later. So this is the thing that actually people come to Tartini's house to see. But I will pass, I will skip. Then on the upper floor, we have a third floor. On the third floor, we have now a room that is called exposition room. And we host here very, very different, very, very, very interesting expositions, even important expositions. And you have to understand that before this Interreg project, it was actually, I don't know in English again, a warehouse, like, you know, like a room where you put everything that you don't need. And now, thanks to this project, thanks to the municipality of Piran, we managed to move away our offices to the Baroque house. And now Tartini house is actually visitable, as you can see. Okay, and going up, we have actually two libraries. I took only the pictures of the older one. It's actually a historical library that is full of books of Vincenzo and Diego de Castro. Diego de Castro was a statistician, and when he died, he gave us all his books, and now we host his books here. And our historian Christian Knes told me that we have many books that are the only copies available. So they are really precious. And going up more, we go to the mansarda, and at the mansarda we will have an interesting electronic instrument, actually some kind of electronic violin that delivers not sound from the strings, but sounds from the magnetic movement of the strings. It's quite an interesting concept, but it's still a work in progress. And on the other side of the mansarda, we have also this pottery and painting laboratory. So as you can see, Casa Tartini is quite interesting because it's full of interesting things that one doesn't expect to see when coming in the house. And finally, we have the terrace, and in this terrace, we have this tool from which I took a photo from one of the ocular. When you can see, you know, as we can see on the picture on the left side, on the upper side, so the site on today's Tartini Square, and then a three-dimensional reconstruction that is done really well of how it could have been looked 150 years ago. You see on the lower side, when there was still this harbor in Piran and this bridge that was opening and closing, and the old towers of the second line of the walls. And on the right, the last picture, I picture it, it's not, it can't be felt because the picture doesn't give you this feeling, but when you are going up to the terrace, you are somehow impressioned by how near it's the tower of the church of Piran, and how tall we are in this Tartini's house that has almost I think it's 768 square meters, so it's quite a big house. Okay, I wanted to finish with what have we done the weekend, the last weekend before this symposium. We had this project, 13 Electronic, that not many people believed in, but since I'm very into this electronic music, electronic instruments, and so on, I made a quite challenging project that had some laboratories for curious people, for pupils and students. We had a contest it was called Make a Devil's Thrill Remix, and we had very interesting participations from all around the world, from America to France to Sweden, from everywhere really, Italy, Slovenia, Croatia, and so on. So it was quite a success. And we managed to do many interesting things, many interesting lessons, and even a very big party that it was actually the first party of quality electronic music in, I think, 20 or 25 years in the municipality of Piran. And people are calling me every day and they are asking to repeat this experience. And so with the help of Margherita Canale from the Conservatory of Music of Trieste, we found quite many connections with electronic music and what was doing Tartini at his time. It's quite interesting. Okay, thank you. I think I talked too much, but I'm open for questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrej. You talked exactly the right amount. Did an amazing job. We started a little bit late, and you came in right on time. This has been a wonderful way for us to start the day, and a tremendous amount of information and some amazing photographs that sort of try to make us feel like we're in Piran. So thank you so much. I think we're about to transition here to a lecture recital. So if you don't mind, we'll jump right to that. But I wanted to thank you again, just on behalf of the Worth Institute and on behalf of our participants here in the symposium. We're really grateful for your time and for this wonderful presentation. So thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope it wasn't boring.
It was excellent. Thank you. And you're quite welcome to stay on the Zoom for the recital if you wish. Of course.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Andrej. I'll ask our in-person participants perhaps to come up to the stage, since we will have a lecture punctuated by some performance, and we'll invite our speaker, Anders Muskens, to take the stage. Anders performed last night for us. He is a early music specialist, keyboardist, a native of Edmonton, but currently studying, completing his PhD at Tübingen University. And the title of his presentation this morning is Performance, Classical Rhetoric, and the Musical Aesthetic of the Long 18th Century. So I'll step aside as we prepare.
Anders and
oh, your presentation material has to be presented on this computer. a stick or
I have a stick
email
with me.
it.
Yeah, here, I have a
Yeah,
stick
because
with me.
if we disconnect from this.
I see. Okay. So then we'll see.
Or you could join the Zoom. Maybe I'll just.
Send to that.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I have also connected with this downstairs.
Oh, you sent it. Okay, so yeah, right here. There you go.
Oh, okay, good. Okay, good.
Is that set up properly?
I think.
The arms.
Oh, well, I mean, I will put it. All right. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Andrej Muskens. As mentioned, sorry. Good morning, everyone. My name is Andrej Muskens, and I, of course, am a specialist in early keyboard instruments and performance. Currently doing my doctorate at the University in Tübingen in Germany. And my presentation today is a brief introduction to the research that I've been doing, which is about applying classical rhetoric as it was understood in the 18th century to musical performance of repertoire from that time, specifically for keyboard instruments. But of course, the insights gained could actually be applied to any number of performers, instruments, singers, the likes. So I guess I would begin today with a brief historical context about the situation within the 18th century. So, as I guess some of you may know already, that this sort of classical humanist education was very prevalent in the 18th century. And a lot of people spoke about the union of the arts. So how artistic disciplines shared a lot of common frameworks in terms of expression, criticism, and specifically oratory, so public speaking, and music were said to be sister arts. So you can see in some of these paintings from the time, the allegory of poetry and music together. And what exactly unified poetry and music? Well, it was said to be the art of classical rhetoric, which, as defined in ancient times, was the art of persuasion by public speaking. So the term eloquence is another term that's sort of associated with it. It deals with the science of speaking well and the persuasion via ethos, pathos, and logos. So the ethos of an individual, the pathos, so emotional persuasion, and logos, sort of logical persuasion. And this was a very important fundamental foundation that many people, artists alike, musicians, visual artists, architects, painters, poets, they drew upon the principles of classical rhetoric as they were established in the ancient sources and also sources from the Renaissance, and used a lot of these principles to define or justify their practice. So to give an example of such a quote, because there are many, but I decided to take one from Christian Friedrich Daniel Schubart in his treatise from 1784. And he observes that the musician observes just those principles which the poet and orator have to observe. That is sure proof of the close bond that unites the arts with one another. So what are those principles actually? If you delve a bit deeper into what people are writing, you'll find that both music and poetry have meter, rhythm, prosody, accent, pitch, cadence, punctuation, periodology. I guess I wasn't sure how to translate that into English, but it's the idea that you have phrase structures with periods and like sentence structure, and also a more formal structure that deals with larger compositions as well. And of course, going further, the idea of style, the idea of genre, decoration, rhetorical figures, tropes, those are also very common in both music and poetry. And most importantly, the artistic intentions, the idea of expressing emotion, moving the passions, persuading the emotions of the listeners. So to take a more modern quote, here's something from Bruce Haynes. And he describes 18th century rhetoric as being the operating system. So the source of the assumptions that musicians had about music. So even if they are not always describing in their sources the exact way that they would be applying ideas of expression, emotional expression, persuasion, it's sort of an underlying principle that guides the way they think about art. So in fact, it was so common in their education that in a way they didn't need to write it in musical sources because people would have known what they were talking about. Unfortunately, we don't know what they're talking about because we're a bit removed from that time. So that's where my research comes in. So my goal was to apply the principles of oratory and acting, theater, poetry, etc. Study the primary sources in an historically informed way. So I wanted to apply principles of classical rhetoric, historical acting, and poetics to musical performance. So I want to do it in a theoretical and practical way. So to study first the primary sources and then actually reconstruct the acting style with the assistance of my supervisor and the research group that he's working with. And using the insights, apply it to historical performance of music. So, but why? Why would you want to do that? Well, of course, if you only focus on the theoretical side, since I'm a performer, I wanted to see how the methods, which are very much concerned with engaging the mind, the body, the imagination, I want to really see how they would work and how they would feel and how I could use them, because they would really inform a lot of information that would not be able to be gained otherwise. And of course, you might also argue that, well, we also speak today, but in fact, the way people spoke in former times and the way they thought about speaking and about rhetoric was quite different. And I'm not sure if I have time to actually show all these examples now, but I wanted to show a comparison of historical performance sake of various speeches of Hamlet through the ages. Now, I guess in the historical performance movement for music, I think people have now demonstrated very clearly that the approach to performing, use of period instruments, the use of understanding stylistic aspects, and that this has been rather successful. Now, in the theater world, this idea is still very much in its infancy. So actually, I will maybe just play one example. This is from one of the very first recordings of an actor, an English actor, 1906. And let's see.
To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether it is nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of struggles and by opposing.
So, and maybe just to show the contrast, I'll take this example from 2018. Uh-oh. I think PowerPoint is frozen. Well, hang on, maybe I'll just start the presentation again. I'm not sure if it's still visible in the Zoom, but maybe someone can inform me if it isn't. But
To be or not to be.
I don't know, maybe the example doesn't load the link properly. I think it's not working properly. Okay, never mind. I will skip that example. And you will take my word for it that the way people act in movies now is significantly different to the way people spoke in the past, which is the reason why such research to understand the way of speaking in the past is important. Because if people were using that style in relation to their discourse on music, to understand how it was applied needs to be done through a source-based approach. Sorry about what actually were. Okay, so just to list some characteristics that past forms of eloquence had. There was really a focus on text and the actual performance of the delivery itself. So the use of, in a very musical way, how to produce cadences, how to produce the meter, how to produce emphasis, rhetorical emphasis, and to create sort of colors in the sound of the speech. And this was done through the use of text, not through a specific method acting or psychological sort of interpretation, but really specifically through engaging with the meaning of the text determining which passions were evident in each section of the text, and then using the mind, the imagination, and the body to recreate these emotional states and project them so that listeners in the audience would feel the emotions that are expressed in the text. So as well, this included like identifying certain structures like rhetorical figures within text that could be used to further express the meaning of the character at a specific point in the narrative, because the texts in the theater were considered to be a type of performance instruction. They were meant to be read aloud or spoken aloud. They were not really meant for silent reflection or reading at home. So here's an example from one source in the 18th century didactic method about speaking, and it shows a text from Pope with various passions expressed in each section. And if you go into to cross-reference with the other parts of the book, he actually gives detailed explanations about the physical signs of the body that need to be part of the expression. So the use of tones of voice, looks, attitudes, so states of the body, positions, gestures, was very important to making sure that the audience understood at every moment what was expressed at that specific point in the text. So just to show another example of what he describes. So, and of course, the audience was quite different. I mean, to read this quote, rather than sitting quietly and taking in art in a very intellectual way, the audience was rowdy. They were yelling. When they liked something, they would cheer and ask for an encore immediately. If they didn't like something, they would throw things at the people on stage. And this sort of very powerful relationship with the audience and the performer actually encouraged the performer to dare to work off of his audience, to sort of amplify expressions. Of course, this is something that's really evident in the theater, but it's really evident, or it's clear that in music, it was also an important way to interact with the audience as well. So, okay, I decided, why not do some demonstration of what this sort of acting style would have looked like? So this is a little excerpt from one method from 1806 by Gilbert Austin, which I studied. He has the text, which is from Shakespeare, from Julius Caesar. This is the speech of Brutus. Immediately after Caesar has been assassinated, he goes out to address the crowd, which of course is tumultuous, which is angry, and they want to kill him, of course. But he has to justify why he did what he did. And you can see that there's a notation for gestures. You can see above the text are letters that correspond to positions and specific movements and types of movement. So like ST, for example, is striking. And below the text are the foot positions. So a lot of the poses, the attitudes that are used in the theater at this period are actually derived from what people saw in Greek sculpture, this contrapposto stance. So the focus on creating elegance, beauty, but also a very spirited, fiery, emotional performance was key in this acting style. So let's see if I can be Brutus.
Romans, countrymen, and lovers, hear before my cause and be silent that you may hear. Believe me for my honor, and have respect unto my honor. Enter me in your wisdom wisdom, and awake your senses that you may the better judge. So, of course, the example is longer, but I just want to show a brief excerpt to give an idea. I'll give a longer excerpt at the end, actually.
So I also wanted to give a brief introduction about some of the methods then, which went into this style of expressive performance. So if you go back to the classical discourse on rhetoric from ancient times, which was very much studied during the 18th century still, Quintilian, Cicero, and Aristotle were the most famous writers on rhetoric. And in his institutes, Quintilian defines his so-called canons of rhetoric, which define a sort of creative process by which an orator, or I guess in our case, an artist, a musician, performer, composer, would go about creating their persuasive work. So the first step being inventio, so the idea that you conceive ideas, subjects, sort of theses that you want to persuade people to. And you think about how to derive arguments from your themes. Dispositio, which deals with the arrangement of ideas. In a lot of the musical rhetorical sources, they deal with the idea of concatenating small tropes or little harmonic patterns and concatenating them in phrases into longer and longer and longer structures. It also deals with larger forms, of course, when you think about the classical structure of an oration having this or exordium, narratio, peroratio, these sorts of structures, how you would state your arguments, that sort of thing. And then there's elocutio, which is style, decoration, genre. How does the choice of genre affect your artistic process? So are you making a work for the church? Are you making a work for the theater or for the salon? And even though you might have a certain theme in music, of course, it's supposed to be the language of passions. Maybe you want to make some music that inspires love and tenderness. But love and tenderness in the theater is definably different from that in the church or in the salon. So different forms, different structures, different sorts of figures would be used depending on the situation or the decorum of your eventual performance. And then there's memoria, which is, of course, memorization. In ancient Rome, they gave all their speeches memorized in front of the Senate. And the final being axio, which deals with delivery, so the actual performance, but in this case, how to take all the ideas that you had before about your themes and your emotions and structures, and how do you actually go out and pronounce them on stage? So this includes, of course, the engagement of emotions, the use of the body, the use of gestures, all these sorts of things. How do you use pauses? How do you perform or how do you pronounce certain sentences so that they're coherent, so that they don't run into each other, so that there's clarity? So I sort of detailed a bit how some of these translate into music. In the case of inventio, people were very interested in describing or sort of depicting passions in the 18th century. So the natural signs of the passions were very well codified. You find all these taxonomies that mention like the various passions and how you identify them, what characteristics they have, what will a person's face look like when they're feeling wonder or joy or jealousy, scorn. And they wanted to sort of paint them in a musical context. So this often in the 18th century meant creating sounds that reflected the sound of the voice when it was engaged in that passion. But of course, it's not as simple as that. There are many other things that would identify passions like genre. For example, even the choice of instruments, using trumpets and timpani creates a sort of festive or militaristic sort of context, while flutes and lute is completely different sort of idea again. And of course, the ideas of disposition and style really translate very quickly into music. Decoration of text, well, ornamentation, all of these concepts. Now, I want to discuss a bit more about the idea of axio performance. How do you actually engage the mind into producing passions when you're performing? So, according to many sources, this is from Berg, but other sources reflect the same idea. Every part of the human frame contributes to express the passions and emotions. So there was an idea of the doctrine of affections, which was, again, this sort of taxonomic classification of various human emotional states. And these taxonomies made sure to show that emotions were observable, perceivable, and clear when observed by other people, by listeners, such that if you were trying to persuade people to feel a certain emotion, you had to assume those tones, looks, and gestures such that people would understand which emotion you were trying to express and then be moved to it. So this was, of course, done through a sort of empathetic process. And going back to ancient times, this whole process was supposed to be animated by genuine feeling. So I think nowadays people often have a conception of the doctrine of affections as being a kind of superficial, sort of presentative way to express emotions, that you assume the look, but you don't actually feel anything. You just look like you're angry and you go into the attitude for anger, and somehow this would produce the effect in listeners. But it seems that in the 18th century, while I'm sure some people must have done that, it was not the ideal way or the preferred way, as far as the critics and the philosophers were concerned, to produce real expression. And I think that anyone could say that a sort of affectatious way to express oneself can always be distasteful for an audience when it's really apparent. So here is a quote from Aaron Hill, who was a theater manager, prompter in London. He actually worked a bit with Handel, and he also corresponded with David Garrick, who was one of the most influential and famous actors in England in the 18th century. And his acting theory, which he published posthumously, was very much associated with, well, it's believed to be associated with the acting style that Garrick was known for. So to take this quote from his magazine, The Prompter, about the actor in tragedy: his look receives the impression and it communicates affection in his air and his utterance. Soon, in the same speech, perhaps the poet has thrown an array or two of hope. At this, the actor's eye should suddenly take fire and invigorate with the glow of liveliness both the action and the accent, till a third and a fourth variety appearing. He stops short upon pensive pauses and makes transitions as the meanings vary into jealousy, scorn, fury, penitence, revenge, or tenderness, all kindled at the eye by the ductility of a flexible fancy and appropriating voice and gesture to the very instant of the changing passion. So what is Aaron Hill talking about? I took a few very specific points from his quotation. So passions start at the eye. So the eye, being the sort of window to the soul, is the place where you must first conceive the passion in your mind, and then the eye must assume the characteristic state that's associated with that passion. So a look of scorn, look of jealousy, because you're responding to an object that you see in your imagination. And then once the impression from your imagination goes upon you, it has to change the physical appearance of the body and the sound of the voice. And then every passion that you see in the text needs to be expressed, and you have to use your plastic imagination or your flexible fancy to immediately transition between all of the various passions quickly. And because this is sometimes maybe a bit artificial or not ideal when you're on stage, like maybe your mind is not working or something, you can jumpstart the process by combining the physical attitude with the imagination. So in his theory, if you start to clench your fists and raise your nostril and feel, you will start to feel anger, and this will jumpstart that process. And then you find yourself angry, and then you can speak. So this is very similar actually to what C.P. Bach describes when he's writing about the ideal musical performer. It's almost exactly the same. It's the musician cannot move others unless he himself is moved. Of course, he's referring to genuine feelings as being the inspiration. And then he talks about how he must shift from passion to passion, so constantly varying the passions, he will barely quiet one before he rouses another. So within music, there are many ways to determine various passions at different points in the text. There are sources from Matheson, for example, that talk about how to depict the characteristics of various keys or various passions with using keys, meter, rhythm, tactus, prosody, etc. And from there, you can go through Aaron Hill's method. You can first determine the emotions at each part of your musical work. You can then find a way to leverage the characteristics in the musical text so that they fit that emotion, so that it's convincing. And then when you perform, assume the emotions and switch between them in this kind of flow that hopefully will produce the desired effect in the listeners. So I took one little example from C.P. Bach, but seeing as we don't have a lot of time, I wonder if it's better to go with the theater example, because it will illustrate a bit more, perhaps in a short amount of time. So, but maybe I can just mention a few points about this excerpt. So this is from one sonata by C.P. Bach in F minor. It's in a key that was described as being very violent and desperate, and not sorrowful in the sense that it's passive, but very desperate and disturbed. So immediately he goes with a fast tempo. He has very sort of janky dotted rhythms in the first theme. And this perhaps could be interpreted as an expression of this sort of desperate despair. Now, then you see in the sixth bar, there's a transition to A flat major, and you have a slightly more tender character coming about. He switches from the dotted rhythm to triplets, but immediately after, they are counteracted again and interrupted by the very aggressive, despairing theme. So maybe I'll just play a short example to give this idea. Oh, I should find a chair for the harpsichord. So I tried when I was playing to start with the angry, despairing, dark idea, but then to really create a transition to a more tender character in bar 6, so that people would feel the softness and tenderness that came in that transition, and then really interrupt it, go back. So this principle could be used, of course, throughout the entire piece, throughout longer works, and you can experiment with engaging the imagination and inspiring emotions to help you find the sound of that specific affect at a specific point. So I think now we will go and do the final, demonstration, which is a longer acting excerpt from Thomas Gray. This is also from Caranomio, and it is an elegy within a country church courtyard, depicting, I don't know, a poem depicting a lone speaker reflecting upon mortality as he examines the graves in the courtyard. And as I do the performance, maybe make note of the sort of techniques I was thinking about, how I tried to make use of the eye and the imagination to see objects that inspire certain affects at different points in the text, and also how the gestures, which are notated, of course, in the source, are used to show the physicality of the embodied passion at each moment. And furthermore, you can also see the musical qualities, the use of pitch, the use of cadence, the use of sense derived through creating cadences in speech, etc. Okay, so I will begin then.
Stop your screen sharing and then people will be able to see you play.
Ah, yes. I think the screen sharing was already stopped. Well, I think when PowerPoint crashed, it stopped. I don't know what people see, actually. I think, yeah, the screen sharing is not working. Well, that's fine. All right.
The curfew tolls the knell of parting. The lowing herd winds slowly o'er the field. The ploughman homeward winds his weary way, and leaves the world to darkness and to now fades the glittering landscape on the sight, and all the air a solemn stillness holds. Save where the beetle wheels his drone flight, and drowsy tinkings lull the distant folds. Save that from yonder ivy-mantled tower, the moping owl does to the moon complain, such as wandering near her secret bower molest her ancient solitary reign. Beneath those rugged elms, that yew tree shade, where heaves the turf in many a mouldering heap, each in his narrow cell forever laid, the rude forefathers of the hamlet sleep. The breezy call of incense breathing warm, the swallow twittering from the straw-built shed, the cock-shrill clarion, or the echoing horn, from their lowly bed. For them, no more the blazing heart shall burn, no busy housewife ply her evening care. No children run to lisp their sighs to turn, or climb his knees the envy kiss to share. Oft did the harvest to their sickle yield, therefore what the stubborn leaf has broke. How jocund the droppers seem of field, how bow the woods beneath their sturdy stroke. Let not ambition mock their useful toil, their homely joys are destiny obscure, nor grandeur here with a disdainful smile the short and simple annals of the poor. The boast of heraldry, the pomp of power, and all that beauty, all that wealth their paid. Alike, the inevitable hour, the path to glory lead but to the grave. Nor you, ye proud, impute to these the fault, if memory of the tomb no trophies raise. When through the long drawn aisle and projected vault, the pealing anthem swells the note of praise. Storied urn, or animated bust, back to its mansion called the fleeting breath. And honest voice provoke the silent dust, or flattery soothe the dull, cold ear of death. Perhaps in this neglected spot is played some heart once pregnant with celestial fire, hands that rod of empire might have swayed. Oh, wait to ecstasy the living life, but knowledge to their eyes her ample page, rich with the spoil of time to ne'er unroll. Chill pen repressed their noble rage, and froze the genial current of the soul. How many gems of purest ray serene, dark unfathomed caves of ocean there. So many flowers born to blush unseen, and waste its sweetness on the desert air. Some village hand that with dauntless breast as a tyrant of his field withstood. Some mute and glorious Milton here may rest. Some Cromwell guilty of his country's blood. The applause of listening senates to command, the threat of pain and ruin to despise, to scatter plenty or a smiling land, and read their history in a nation's eyes, their lot for bad. Nor circumscribed alone the growing virtue, the crimes confined, there to wade through slaughter to a throne and shut the gates of mercy on mankind. All right, that's it. All right. So if anyone has any quick questions, I don't know if there's actually time, but please. We're out of time. We'll have questions in the reception. Thank you, everyone. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. We'll adjourn briefly for 15 minutes. That means we will reconvene at 10:35. Thank you. I apologize for the technical difficulties.
Yeah, we can adjust. Yes.
Alex, you were sitting up there for the whole time now.
Wherever you like. Sorry, I can sit wherever you like.
Good. I like people to music, but
Hi, Shirley. Are you up first?
I am. I'm here already. Yeah.
We're just reconvening here.
Okay.
And everybody, it appears that yes, we're just returning to the session. It appears that looking who's online, everybody who's in this paper session is standing by. It's Cristina, I think, and Shirley and Cristina and Chiara.
Yes.
Yes. Very good.
Yes.
Well,
Good morning.
welcome back, everyone. And again, my apologies for the technical weirdness for the hack, but I heard from some of you that this has happened to some of you just recently, and in fact, I received an email almost immediately from Andrej in Piran, and the same thing happened with their association just recently at a community event, and it's a curious mixture of disturbing and absurd, and I don't know what to make of it. Only to say, our media specialist quickly came down to the hall and said, "We will edit all of that out. It's not going out on YouTube." So, I see our session chair, Professor Fabio Morabito, is on his way over here, so he will introduce himself to you briefly here now.
Hello, good morning or afternoon for you if you are in Europe. How is everyone doing? We are not quite yet starting, am I right?
Yes, we can begin. Yes.
We can begin, okay. Then I guess welcome back to the first, actually the second session of this day conference on Tartini. It's an absolute delight to be here. My name is Fabio Morabito. I am a musicologist working here at the University of Alberta. And our first speaker for today is Dr. Shirley Thompson. Hello, Shirley. And Dr. Shirley Thompson is currently interim principal at the Royal Birmingham Conservatoire in the UK. She has done a lot of work on the French composer Marc-Antoine Charpentier. She's worked at the University of Wolverhampton before coming to the Royal Birmingham Conservatory. She has published critical editions on the composer's motets. I'm talking still about Marc-Antoine Charpentier, of course. She has co-edited a book on Rameau's opera, and numerous other articles and book chapters. And today she's gonna be talking us about Tartini à la française, the Concerti Grossi of Charles Henri de. And I cannot read the title because it's covered, but you may want to repeat the title. Over to you, Shirley.
Thank you very much, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. It's lovely to be here speaking to you today. So, Tartini à la française, the Concerti Grossi of Charles Henri de Blainville. The concerto grosso is not a genre we associate with 18th century France. It's therefore surprising that around 1751, Charles-Henri de Blainville published a set of 6 such works in Paris. My slides are stuck, bear with me. Here we go. Arrangements of 6 of Tartini's sonatas for solo, violin and continuo. These concerti grossi were published under the Italian form of the arranger's name, Carlo Blainville, in keeping with the Italian nature of the collection and perhaps to ensure the appeal of the volume to the Italophile consumer. It's presumably because of the unusual character of these works, published in separate parts, that the collection has so far escaped attention. I've recently begun a project which will involve preparing editions of these concertos, and they turn out to be extremely attractive works which reveal Blainville to have been a sensitive and imaginative arranger of his original Tartini material. Today, I'd like to introduce these pieces, to speculate about what inspired them, and in particular, to explore the French composer's approach to transforming Tartini's originals. Blainville's compositional output, some of which is now lost, crossed vocal and instrumental genre, and included a number of pieces which were heard at the Concert Spirituel. He seems, however, to have gained more attention as a theorist than a composer, publishing 4 theoretical works. The assessment by the Belgian musicologist critic Fétis of these writings as less than mediocre seems rather harsh, given that Blainville's ideas invited sympathy as well as controversy. Of most relevance to the present topic is that in one of his writings, L'Esprit de l'art musical of 1754, Blainville makes reference to Tartini alongside Locatelli and also of relevance here, Geminiani. He writes, "There are also pieces of purely instrumental music instilled with so much truth that they seem to suggest words to express feelings, images, or pictorial effects. Such seems to me to be the music of Tartini, a true language of sounds with musical phrases based on the purest melody and on the art of making the violin sing." Indeed, he goes on, his concertos are truly the triumph of that instrument, which seems in them to declaim a fine speech with which the other parts appear associated merely to maintain the key and the connection of the ideas. If their tuttis were more diverse, whether by more lively repetitions, by more varied features, or by more striking harmonies, these concertos would not fail to please more generally. But on the whole, the music of this composer is no less precious on that account to those who sufficiently cherish the truth of the instrument to ignore such things that only add to their beauties. Tartini's music was certainly getting exposure in Paris. His music was performed there, and his 9 volumes of solo violin sonatas were published there in the years immediately preceding Blainville's concertos. Tartini had a particularly strong advocate in the form of his French pupil, Pierre Pagin, who had studied with him in Padua and who played his works at the Concert Spirituel. What's more, it was Pagin who most likely transported the manuscripts of Tartini's Opus 4 and 5 to Paris and saw them through the publication process. While Pagin was evidently a fine violinist, on what turned out to be his last performance at the Concert Spirituel on Easter Sunday in 1750, he was hissed. Beverly Wilcox's excellent article on this particular event proposes a number of compelling reasons as to why, not least because of a lack of understanding of what to the French was an unfamiliar musical style and manner of performance, one apparently laced with pointless Italian virtuosity. In this context, Blainville's decision to publish his own arrangement of Tartini's music just at this point in time is all the more surprising. Tartini's solo violin sonatas clearly require a skillful player. By the middle of the 18th century, violin technique in France had begun to catch up with that of the Italians, having lagged significantly behind in the 17th century. Corrette, writing retrospectively about the arrival in France of Corelli's Opus 5 violin sonatas, wrote how the Duc d'Orléans, not being able to find any violinist in Paris at that time capable of playing chords, was obliged to have them sung by 3 voices. While that's perhaps a tall story, it draws attention to the fact that French violinists at that time were not in the same league technically as their Italian counterparts. Corrette, however, makes a contrast with the situation by 1753. He writes, "The number of good violinists presently in Paris is evidence of just how much music has progressed since the advent of the sonata." Indeed, it was the appearance of French collections of solo violin sonatas in the early 18th century which, as Peter Walls tells us, projected a sense of the prestige of Corelli's Opus 5 and of French violinists' eagerness to assimilate its structural and technical lessons. The first of these collections, published in 1704, was by the Neapolitan violinist and composer Michele Mascitti. Now, Mascitti was responsible for another first, which is even more relevant in the present context. That is, in 1727, he published the first Concerti Grossi in France, 4 of them within a volume of violin sonatas. Another individual relevant to a discussion of Blainville's publication is the composer Francesco Geminiani, who spent 3 periods in Paris and whose music was well known there. Between 1749 and 1758, there were some 14 performances of his works at the Concert Spirituel, including, on the 8th of December 1750, Une sonate du 5e œuvre de Corelli, mise en grand concert par Geminiani. Indeed, this may well be where Blainville got the idea for his own Tartini arrangements from. These concertos had been published in 2 volumes in London in 1726 and 29 and were widely circulated. There's evidence that Amsterdam editions of both volumes were on sale in Paris in the mid-1730s, and a reprint combining them into a single volume was published there in the early 1740s. Certainly, Blainville admired Geminiani's music. Though declaring him less original than Tartini and Locatelli, he described him as the man of taste in his sonatas and the great artist in his concertos. Might we suppose then that Blainville's inspiration came from 3 sources: from his enthusiasm for Tartini, for continuing in the wake of Mascitti's volume, and from the models provided by Geminiani? And might we also suppose that his arrangements of Tartini for a string ensemble, in which scoring possibilities are automatically increased, were done with the intention of achieving the more lively repetitions and more varied features that he wrote about in relation to Tartini's concertos? Let us see. 5 of the 6 sonatas that Blainville arranges are present in Tartini's Opus 1, a set of 12 sonatas and a pastoral published in Amsterdam by Le Sen in 1734. Significantly for our present purposes, perhaps, the set was newly engraved and published in Paris by Leclerc around 1744. The 6th sonata that Blainville arranges appeared in Tartini's Opus 6, published by Leclerc around 1748. And there's no concordance for this sonata, so we might presume that this was Blainville's source. But where the other 5 sonatas are concerned, we might automatically assume that Blainville was also working from the French edition. However, several clues suggest that he was actually using the Dutch one. For example, while the French engraving lacks an allegro marking here, it's present in the Dutch engraving and in Blainville. The French engraving lacks a sharp here at the arrow, but it's present in the Dutch engraving and in Blainville. And we find further missing accidentals in the French engraving, which are present in the Dutch engraving and in Blainville. There's one example here and another one here. So far, I've studied in detail just 3 of the concertos in the collection, numbers 1, 2, and 6. Now, given that I'm fairly early on in my work on this project, the following observations emerge from what is effectively a pilot survey focusing on these 3 concertos, and I'm looking forward to continuing this over the other 3. But let's turn our attention now to how Blainville treats Tartini's material. First, broad observations to begin with, based on what I've looked at so far. First, Blainville rescores Tartini's violin and continuo, which you can see here in the red box at the top, for a 3-part concertino of 2 violins and continuo of organ and cello, and a 3-part ripieno of violin, viola, and bass, which is also figured. Now, this is actually a different lineup from what we find in Geminiani's arrangements of Corelli's Opus 5, where the ripieno involves a 2nd violin, though Blainville is in line with Maschiti's Concerto Grossi scoring. Second, structurally, Blainville retains all Tartini's material except for 2 bars of the last movement of the Pastoral, which he omits, shortening the repetition of a presto section and omitting a fermata in the original, perhaps to enable a greater sense of continuity in the ensemble version. There are no instances in the Blainville set in which whole movements are omitted, as happens in Geminiani's Corelli arrangements, where he suppresses fast movements from his models on several occasions, perhaps because they weren't entirely suitable for the new scoring. By extension, thirdly then, I'm starting to develop a sense that Blainville is rather more faithful to his models than Geminiani, who, as Rudolf Rasch has shown, reshaped Corelli's material. We might presume that because Corelli's music was already well known to the public. Still, as we will see, Blainville does subject his models to some interesting variation, and we'll come to that in due course. In 2 of the 3 concertos I've looked at so far, Blainville's approach, as we might expect, is to transfer the solo violin line verbatim into his principal violin part. This is perhaps unsurprising in Concerto 2, where the original violin line includes relatively little double stopping. You can see the start of the 3rd movement here, where the line is transferred as it is. But it's perhaps more of a surprise that where there are double stops in this sonata, Blainville retains them in his principal violin rather than automatically sharing the notes out. So you can see that here. You can see that here. We also find this approach in his Concerto 6, where the original double stopping is more extensive, as you can see here. Tartini, incidentally, indicates scordatura tuning for this pastoral, in which the lowest strings of his solo violin are retuned to A and E. Now, Blainville retains this, making these particular chords straightforward. Elsewhere, however, Tartini's double or multiple stoppings tend to be shared between the 2 concertino violins. As you can see in this example, and in this one. Now, this tends to be Geminiani's approach to Corelli. His principal concertino violin part contains relatively few double stops. In the process of arranging the original Tartini, Blainville uses the opportunity to introduce variation, particularly to exploit the fact that he can go beyond the limitations of what is possible on a single solo violin. The kinds of variants we find are too numerous to illustrate in full here, but these few examples give a flavour. So here at the blue arrows, if you compare with the red arrows, you can see repetitions of notes in Blainville in places of rests in the original. Here, a redistribution of Tartini's material at the top includes the addition of ornaments to the repeated E's in Blainville's version, which you can see at the bottom. Oops. And here we get an inversion of the lines of the original texture. So the original bass line appears in Concertino Violin 2, while the lower part of the original violin line is requisitioned as a bass line. Yet these adjustments never seem to distort the original material. And what I haven't picked up in Blainville is the extent of adaptation of the model that, as I suggested earlier, we sometimes find in Geminiani's approach to Corelli. If you compare the boxed passages here, you can see Geminiani breaking the continuous semiquavers of his Corelli model with patches of simplified rhythms. And that necessitates, in turn, adjustment to the melodic material. Moving to the bass line, as we might expect, Blainville almost always adopts Tartini's, but with a couple of striking exceptions. Here, Tartini's opening gestures in the bass are refashioned, as you can see at the bottom, before Blainville settles down to following the original. And here's another example where Blainville adopts a freer approach. He replaces Tartini's bass line, but he actually then adopts its melodic shape in his Concertino Violin 2 part. Figuring is another matter. There are places where Blainville copies the Tartini engraving quite carefully. Places, and including the passage immediately preceding this one, where he leaves figures out. And there are places where he supplies additional figures. There are places where Blainville presents the original figuring in a different way. And it's also worth noting the fact that there tend to be small discrepancies in the figuring between the two bass parts in Blainville's arrangements. Where Blainville's ripieno violin is concerned, this generally follows the principal violin in the full sections, but without the double stops. You can see that here. Occasionally, it has a filler role along with the viola, as you can see in the box there. The viola, however, also sometimes takes on the role of doubling the bass an octave higher. You can see that there. And sticking with the viola, we can see that it sometimes takes on a melodic bass function all of its own. The role and nature of Blainville's second Concertino violin part varies depending on his distribution of Tartini's violin line, as we've already seen. There are places where he gives it the original material, while freely inventing something else in the principal violin. Here, for example, it adopts Tartini's multiple stops. More often, though, this part isn't given Tartini's original material, and so it's where, most of all, we can see Blainville's own invention. Unsurprisingly, it often works in thirds or sixths with the principal violin, sometimes overlapping, but at other times it functions quite independently, enhancing the musical material. Here, for instance, it works in imitation with the principal violin. And another example of that there. And here are a couple of passages where it adds its own melodic counterpoint to the original material. So Tartini's solo violin line here transferred to the violin lines in Blainville, and the bass line similarly transferred to Blainville's bass line. Meanwhile, Blainville then writes an independent melodic counterpoint in that second Concertino violin, and he gives the viola a filler part. Here then, similarly, Tartini's violin line becomes both violin lines in Blainville. The bass line is adopted in Blainville's, but we get here both an independent Concertino violin 2 part and an independent viola part, providing the counterpoint to the original. Now, it's instructive too to look at the general scheme of the three concertos I've studied so far to get a sense of the way in which Blainville deals with the concertino-ripieno opposition. The overwhelming impression is that there's rather more tutti than solo. Interspersed reduced passages take a variety of forms and lengths and scoring. So a summary of the changes of scoring in the presto of Concerto 1, for example, gives a sense of the variety within one movement. But it's worth noting that even here, less than a third of the movement involves reduced forces. The scoring shown in red here, which is the reduced scoring, takes up a mere 43 out of 136 bars or measures. But whereas here we do get some extended sections for one or both concertino violins, this isn't always the pattern that Blainville adopts. In Concerto number 2 in particular, there are no extended sections for the concertino violins. In fact, we only have to take a quick look at the opening of the first movement to see that there's a real patchwork here as the scoring shifts. I'll let this speak for itself. You can see a kind of kaleidoscope as the scoring changes from the various different groupings of the instruments. This avoidance of a strong concertino-ripieno contrast is certainly the case in the second movement of Concerto 2, where the emphasis falls essentially on the principal violin. Nonetheless, Blainville most definitely adds interest to Tartini's solo violin line. So to end, I'd like to give you a flavour of that. First, let's hear Tartini. And now here's Blainville's arrangement. Now, this is a computer-generated performance, but despite that, it still gives you a sense of the richness of the texture that Blainville weaves around Tartini's original. So I hope that what I've shared from my research so far provides a taste of Blainville's arrangements, adding more generally to our picture of Italian music in mid-18th century Paris. While Blainville shows utmost respect for his original models, he presents Tartini's music in a new and attractive light, creating works which are surely, undoubtedly worthy of modern attention. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shirley. I don't know if you heard the applause because the microphone was muted. Did you hear it?
I didn't, but it's good to know there was some. That's great. Thank you.
There you go. Thank you so much for this fascinating paper. I'm so curious. I have so many questions, but first I'm gonna open the floor if anyone wants to jump us in. I will, yes. Well, perhaps I can start with a little query. Can you remind me when it was published, this collection of Blainville arrangements?
It's undated, but it's believed to be around 1751.
1751, okay.
Yeah.
Totally fascinating. So I didn't know anything about this arrangement before you start talking, but I know very well Geminiani arrangements of Corelli's sonata. And I loved how you jumped back and forth between the two and also proposing a comparison. And I was wondering so far, because you've looked only at 3 of these concertos, in general, what do you think about the agency of Blainville as as kind of like repurposing this music? Was he also, I may have missed something at the beginning of your paper, do we know if he played it as well?
He was, well, we know he was a cellist, and amongst other things. We don't know if he took part in performances. We don't know anything really about the collection apart from the fact that it exists. I think that's really our sum total. But we know that he was his pupil, and the Marquise de Villeroy, what had been his pupil and became his patron. And the residence of the Marquise de Villeroy had its own theatre, in which we know that performances of operas were tried out, if you like, before they were presented at the Académie Royale de Musique. And so we might suppose that there was opportunity for performance and that Blainville was in the orbit of that, but that's kind of supposition.
Yeah, and do we have any idea of who the violinist might have been?
Absolutely none. No, there is frustrating, as far as I've been able to come across so far, and I'm very happy if anybody else wants to point me in the direction of more evidence. That's one of the reasons for kind of exposing the material, really, is I'm certainly not a Tartini expert, and my expertise in French music tends to lie a bit more in the 17th century. So I'm very happy for anyone that has further or unearths further information to let me know. But in my research so far, I've not been able to uncover anything specific, which is frustrating but fascinating at the same time.
Sometimes that's how history works. Don't be frustrated. But my curiosity is that do you think that some of these aspects that you showed us about how basically the orchestration, the reorchestration of it was made, do you think that's something to do specifically à la française? Is this something that you think you identify as a French approach to this kind of repertoire, or do you think it could be also something that has to do more with Blainville?
Yes, it's difficult to say, because I think, you know, as the concept of the concerto was, and certainly the concerto grosso was kind of alien to France, really. It's tempting to think that the models were Geminiani, but interestingly, the parallels with the scoring look closer to Machiti, which was the first collection some decades earlier. So there's very little French music in that sense to sort of compare it with. So I again, in terms of whether or not it's Blainville or following a model, it's very difficult because the models are so few.
Yeah, no, I totally understand. And I get what you're saying about that there seems to be a taste that is more French with the viola, with some of the more, there is the texture that is not this polarized. It reminded me of Charpentier, for example, when some scores there are orchestrated with 2 viola parts. You know, there seems to be a taste for French music in this period that has a more kind of like a more, not dense, but sort of like more interesting internal parts.
Yes, you could be that. I mean, that could well explain the choice of the viola rather than over the 2 violins of Geminiani. That could, actually, that's a really good point.
This said, I know of Stradella's scores organized with concertino and ripieno that also use a viola. So you might want to take a look at some of them.
That's great. Thank you.
No problem. Yeah. Any inputs from the audience or any curiosity, anything that struck your attention that you want to ask Shirley about? Oh, Zoom. Okay, how do I do that? Doesn't seem like anyone is writing at the moment. I have another little question, and so we'll see. The last example that you showed us, when you played it, thank you so much for doing that, by the way, because I thought that really gave an impression of some of the work that is happening. I was really curious why you were talking, like, how does this sound? Has anyone recorded it? First of all, has anyone recorded it? No, you're doing the edition for the first time.
Yeah, that's right. I have tried some. I have done a little version of this paper with some students of mine, and we did have a tryout. And it's just I didn't have I rather silly didn't record them. Otherwise, we could have heard something that was slightly less computer generated. But no, I think that I really haven't come across any references to them at all in any context. So unless, yeah, I have not at all.
Yeah. No, but I was intrigued because in that except, it seemed that the second violin of the concertino was almost in imitation to the first, which is certainly something that wasn't in the original. And that kind of like goes back to what I was asking you about the very beginning when I was talking about the agency. That probably, you know, catapults us in a universe of music in which people maybe were not feeling the pressure of being that close to source. It was part of maybe the culture of the time in general, how people thought about playing something again.
Yes, yeah. Well, I mean, Blainville was a composer, and therefore, you know, he was able to do that, as he was able to bring that to this, I suppose, as you say, and maybe not being so close to the model, freed him up to do that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Can we give to Shirley another round of applause?
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So our next speaker. See if Cristina, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Wow, can you turn on your camera?
Yes.
Hello.
Hello.
Oh, how are you doing?
Yes, great, thank you.
Welcome to the University of Alberta.
Thank you.
Virtually. So this is Dr. Cristina Scuderi. She studied organ, harpsichord, electronic music, and then while doing these wonderful studies at conservatory, she also studied university music history at the University of Padua, and then in Udine for a PhD. She has obtained the habilitation at the University in Graz, where she is active as a researcher and lecturer. She is also a lecturer at the University of Vienna and at the Conservatory of Trieste. Since 2005, she has been co-managing the international composition competition Città di Udine and the Contemporanea New Music Festival. She has a monograph about opera in Eastern Adriatic theaters in the period between 1861 and 1918. But also she's been doing fabulous, incredibly thought-provoking research about the female students of Giuseppe Tartini in the context of the School of Nations at the Università di Padova. And she's been also working long-term in a sort of Italy-Slovenia sort of like network about the transcription of the literary text of theoretical treatises published by Giuseppe Tartini, not to mention manuscripts that have to do with the regole per arrivare a saper ben suonare il violino. And today, Cristina's paper, the title is Reconstructing Giuseppe Tartini's School of Nations, Methodological Issues and Hypotheses on a Biographical Investigation. The floor is yours, Cristina.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Here is evening, actually. Do you see the slides? Sorry. Is it okay with the slides?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, perfect, thanks. So, so first of all, I would like to thank Professor Alexander Carpenter also for having organized such a symposium. I'm really glad to share with you some considerations on the School of Nations. My first aim was to reconstruct the extent of the School of Nations by taking a census of Tartini's pupils in order to gain a very concrete understanding of the extent of his school and consequently the scope of his educational work. It is well known that Tartini had many pupils, and he himself testifies to this in a letter to Johann Friedrich Werner, in which he writes, quote, "I have had many Protestant pupils and Saxon, Prussian, Dutch, English pupils. I am an honest man. I know the way of the world," end quote. But how many and who were these pupils really? If we try to reconstruct the extent of the school, we cannot rely on Tartini himself, because in his epistolary that has come down to us today, the students named are a clear minority of those known today. His letters don't reach 20% of the total known today. There are just over 20 names. We have to wait until Ugo Riemann for the first somewhat more substantial, though not complete information. In 1929, he spoke of the existence of around 70 students, but he only mentioned the most important ones. The information was then taken up 6 years later by Minos Dounias, when in a note to his work, the Violin Concerto, Giuseppe Tartini's, provided a list of 70 documentable students. Although it wasn't the main purpose of his work, Dounias was the first to attempt a systematic list of Tartini's pupils, not without its problems. He even made this list in a footnote. In fact, Dounias dubbed Giulio Meneghini a Giulietto Tromba, a misunderstanding into which Gerber, Arthur Pugin, and after him Lev Ginsburg fell before him, not knowing at the time that they were the same person. Some 10 years after Dounias' pivotal work, it was then the turn of Antonio Capri, who, following Dounias' lead, tried to draw up a list of names, confirming all those collected by his predecessor and adding some already mentioned by Eximeno in 1772 and only by him in the literature, such as Bottesi and Freddi. There were also problems of doubling here, already reported by Dounias, for example, with the Lorenz Schmidt and Joseph Schmidt, now assimilated into the single Lorenz Joseph Schmidt. The same happens for Paolo Guastaroba and Paolino, for instance. They would be the same person. Curiously, Pugnani wasn't mentioned, perhaps taking Carlo Schmidt's assumption that it couldn't be claimed that Pugnani had been a pupil of Tartini's in Padua. So today, we are able to bring the tally up to around 115 names from 73 known and put together in the literature. So more than 40 have been added. Although we are aware that the figure is underestimated and that some of these still remain in doubt. Of the, quote, crowd of young people and professors, end quote, of which Ugoni spoke, referring to these pupils, we can at least define an initial nucleus that has been implemented with respect to the past. I have tried to build the first database to try to take a census of pupils in secondary literature where they are explicitly referred to as Tartini's pupils. The left-hand column lists the pupils in alphabetical order, in red those about whom we have some doubt. The top right-hand column shows the sources starting before Tartini's death and therefore pre-1770. There is Tartini's epistolary with the last date 1770. In yellow are the dictionaries. This is not complete. This is just a short snapshot. It is a very long list, actually. In this way, we can see which names were best known in history by reading the table horizontally and counting the occurrences and who traced them. By reading vertically, we can see what authors have named the students and in what quantity. The work of Dounias and Capri, for example, is very, very clear. This gives us information about the interest in the various violinists in historiography and helps us to understand which figures had a larger impact in history and narrative. As far as tracking in dictionaries is concerned, more than a dozen have been used, starting with the historical ones up to the most important ones in current use. I started from the Dizionario Storico-Critico degli Scrittori di Musica by Bertini, going on with the Cron-Fayol Dictionnaire Historique des Musiciens, and then Pietro Lichtenthal, Dizionario Bibliografia della Musica. Of course, the Biographie Universelle des Musiciens by Fétis. Actually, I have to say it was a bit of disappointment in terms of the number of pupils survived here in the Biographie Universelle. Musikalisches Konversationslexikon by Mendel, and Quellenlexikon by Eitner, which is still considered a monument for musical biographies. Riemann Music Lexicon, Dizionario Universale dei Musicisti in its 3rd edition. And coming to the most recent ones, Dizionario Biografico degli Italiani and Dizionario Enciclopedico Universale della Musica e dei Musicisti. It's our I say for Italians, our Deum, so the most important source we have nowadays in form of dictionary, in form of an encyclopedia of music. The New Grove Dictionary of Music and Musicians, and the Musik in Geschichte und Gegenwart. I always refer to Tartini's pupils mentioned as such, and not to pupils simply present with a biographical entry. There is a difference, of course. The interesting thing to note is that contemporary dictionaries haven't made much headway. For example, the Grove Music Online cites 25 pupils as opposed to the 27 cited by Cron-Fayol in 1817. It is true that the lower number may be due to the realization over time that someone wasn't, in fact, Tartini's pupil, but this isn't always the case. Hence the importance of always turning to historical dictionaries, because contemporary ones aren't necessarily implemented. I have produced an onomasticon based on the comparison of secondary literature and printed sources from the 18th century. Unfortunately, I cannot report it in a slide for reasons of space. It is very, very extensive. Here I have only listed the first column with the names, but it is an Excel file with many columns. This is currently the list with 115 names. In red are the doubtful ones, even if there was the slightest doubt, I have indicated with another color. So the onomasticon presents for each pupil or presumed pupil certain information like the dates of birth and death when present, the origin of the pupil, the places of activity, the years in which the pupil studied with Tartini when detectable, again, the contacts with third persons in the musical or cultural environment more generally, Tartini's testimony, if any, deduced from the epistolary, and vice versa, the testimony of the pupil about Tartini. Testimonies of third parties are added when present. It is indicated whether the pupil in question was also a composer, and most pupils were, as can be seen from the data, and his presence in the form of any entry in both old and modern dictionaries. The field sources, which gives us an indication of the texts where the information could be retrieved, is followed by the field notes, and then the students' known musical production deduced from RISM and MGG is also indicated. I have tried to draw up a pupil's chronologies in order to display the turnover of pupils where it could be reconstructed. This won't be the final version of the chart. At the moment, I have drawn it up in Excel in the form of a Gantt chart, but I would like to find another solution. At the moment, a row is reserved for each pupil. For some, we only have a possible starting year without an indication of a certain duration in studies, and for others, a before. For instance, we know that Morigi was a pupil before 1753. I haven't yet indicated this because it could potentially have been a pupil in the previous 20 years. Of Ferrari, it is the same, pre-1750, according to Eitner. Or we read, for instance, in some sources, Mazzorana was one of Tartini's last pupils, but what does it mean? Which years? It is not written. So in green are indicated the years in which a pupil with documentary certainty was in Padua with Tartini. In gray are indicated the presumed years. It is possible that for the same pupil, there are some green and some gray rectangles in this chart if the sources don't agree. In the case of Dall'Oglio, for instance, we have 3 possible tranches of study with Tartini from 1721, from 1727, or in 1732. This according to different sources. So figuring out where the truth is a very, very difficult task. Thanks to such a graph, we can also discover who was at Tartini's house at the same time for study purposes in the same years, and we can thus speculate on possible acquaintances between students. For example, with a reasonable degree of certainty, we can say that in 1739, Helendal, Nardini, Pagin, a certain Paggio Ambasciatore del Re di Spagna, so page ambassador of the King of Spain, Shelf, and perhaps Stratico were studying at Tartini's house at the same time. In a letter of 1739, Tartini actually says, quote, "I will be here until July with 6 pupils," end quote. So it seems to add up. We should bear in mind that Tartini had a minimum of 2 up to a maximum of 10 pupils a year for the 40 years from 1727 to 1767. In theory, therefore, there should never be more than 10 names at the same time, reading the graph vertically. Averaging 5 pupils a year for 40 years would result in about 200 pupils. But it is also true that the turnover wasn't always annual. There were those who stayed 2 years, for instance. So 150 students might be a plausible figure. Doubtful pupils include those whom Eitner described as aus Tartini's Schule. And this expression doesn't let us know whether the person in question was in detail a direct pupil of Tartini or belonged to his school in general. This is the case with Bernardo Angelini, for instance. Coron Fayol also mentions Bottesi and Costanzi as de l'école de Tartini. Wolfgang Türkes, quoted by M.G.G., who may initially have seemed to be a direct pupil, turned out instead to be Tartini's Enkelschüler. So he started with a pupil, but it isn't known with whom. Today, there are also people in the circle of pupils of whom there is unfortunately still very, very little biographical information, if any, other than just a name. Dictionaries, in fact, count less than half of the people we can include in this ideal list today. Then there are the totally anonymous. Nothing is known at the moment about such figures. A religioso polacco is a Polish clergyman. This is the one who proposed the Maddalena Lombardini sermon to the King of Poland, for instance. Or like the Paggio Ambasciatore del Re di Spagna, so the page of His Excellency the Ambassador of Spain, who by Tartini's own admission was his pupil. Or of 2 anonymous brothers brought by their mother, a Venetian gentlewoman settled in Padua to study with the violinist. Meissner tells of a, quote, Venetian gentlewoman widowed and mother of 2 children who had settled in Padua so that Tartini could instruct them in music. This gentildonna was looking for a copist to transcribe the various musical pieces that the maestro composed for them. The copist in this case would have been Naumann. The identity of these 2 brothers can still be debated. Were then Francesco and Giulio Meneghini? They aren't the brothers of Benedetto Marcello for sure, as Tartini instructed them in Venice. Francesco Caffi in his Storia della Musica says, quote, Francesco Gasparini instructed Benedetto Marcello in counterpoint. The celebrated violinist Giuseppe Tartini taught the violin to his other brothers. He uses the plural brothers. So this presupposes that he also taught other brothers than Alessandro Marcello. These brothers are definitely not the Salieri brothers, as their father died after their mother. So these brothers also remain anonymous for the time being. There is no reason to believe that Antonio Salieri was then a pupil of Tartini, as one reads here and they are today without any additional elements. His brother Francesco Salieri was indeed a pupil, and Antonio then studied with his brother. So one can therefore think of a passage of information and practices within the family circle. However, there are no elements to include Antonio in a direct apprenticeship. Singular is the case of Giulio di Terni, who, according to Charles Burney, went from being Tartini's teacher to his pupil. There is no Tartinian biographer who actually mentions this musician. Michael Burden advances the hypothesis that he may have been Tartini's teacher during the period he spent in Assisi, and Burney informs us of this fact, quote, Tartini's first master was an obscure musician of the name of Giulio di Terni, who afterwards changed places with Tartini and became his scholar. This circumstance Mr. Wiesemann had from Tartini himself, who used to say that he studied very little till after he was 30 years of age, end quote. Unfortunately, there were also those who boasted that they belonged to the Tartinian school simply because it was prestigious to be able to say they were pupils. This naturally makes it more difficult to make the necessary distinctions. Notable is the case of the Neapolitan Pupo, who claimed to have been 5 years in contact with Tartini. La Houssaye, definitely a pupil, a real pupil of Tartini, is said to have denied these statements, claiming that Pupo had never met Tartini. So this is one word against the other. So in the absence of further sources, we cannot say anything. Tartini's teaching activity certainly didn't begin with 1728, the year of the School of Nations was founded, but must be dated back to at least 1720. If we consider that Girolamo Ascanio Giustiniani was his pupil in that year and the following 1721, the fact that Tartini taught Venetian patricians was a guarantee of prosperity and also of acquiring a higher social status at the time. 3 years later, when Tartini was in Prague, he taught Graun. And 3 years after meeting Graun had Bach's son Wilhelm Friedmann as a pupil, so one can think of an indirect transfer of knowledge to Bach's son, therefore. And several students at the time of the school's official establishment had already been trained, as Burney himself testifies. Quote, by the year 1728, he had made many excellent scholars and formed a school or method of practice for the students on the violin, end quote. Upon arrival at Tartini's school, the students already had developed the skills in the use of the instrument. It is known that they were musicians who already had training. Maddalena Lombardini, for example, had already studied with Antonio Kubli, another Tartini's pupil. The majority of the pupils were also composers as well as performers. This would have enabled them to aspire not only to a career as a violinist, but also to that of concertmeister or Kapellmeister, even abroad. There was a percentage of students who, while addressing Tartini directly, were diverted by him to his own students. So Tartini sent to his pupils other students to instruct. Let's take, for example, Wiesemann, who ended up studying with Pasqualino Bini on the recommendation of Tartini himself. This was in 1738, so not at the end of his career. Another case would seem to have been that of Pitcher, who, having arrived in Italy in 1760, asked to study with Tartini, but was entrusted to Naumann. Studying with Tartini's pupils was, however, considered prestigious. It would be interesting to know who sent to his direct students, perhaps simply those he didn't want or couldn't keep. It isn't known whether the hypothesis is viable, the hypothesis that he diverted pupils sent to him by those of a lesser rank, not least because we know that 1 or 2 of these pupils a year were taken by him out of charity. Per carità, that means without paying the costs of their education because they were poor. So I don't see this hypothesis as viable, probably. In 1761, at the age of 70, we know that by his own testimony, he taught 10 hours a day, 7 continuous hours in the morning and 3 in the afternoon. With such a great demand, he certainly couldn't have satisfied everyone, so it was necessary to refer some students to his own pupils. In one part of his epistolary, he states, quote, so the students come, or rather most of them have come as a guest and from far away, so that they cannot be sent back home, and they are servants of princes. End quote. It transpires from this sentence the urgency and responsibility of having to fulfill his educational function, and the fact that once the student had arrived, he couldn't be left without lessons. So there was definitely a section of potential pupils that was being accommodated in some other way. And to conclude, I then tried to set up a further database of genealogies absolutely in progress. Some of Tartini's pupils were themselves violin teachers. Along with the list of Tartini's currently known pupils, an attempt has also been made here to list the pupils of the pupils. That means the first generation that followed Tartini's direct pupils. In the pupils of this de facto second generation, we find names that are repeated for various teachers, such as Bartolomeo Campagnoli, who studied with both Paolo Tommaso Alberghi, Guastaroba, and also with Nardini. Thus, he had 3 teachers who were all 3 pupils of Tartini. From such a graph, the schools emerge at a glance. See, for example, the case of Nardini. It should be organized as a tree. This graph is in progress also. So the work is very, very long. It is a very important amount of documentation. I will conclude by saying that to understand Tartini's educational contribution in Europe, one must consider the performing aspect and the compositional aspect. So work on a double track, take into consideration the connection Tartini had with poetry. So the inspiration to good poetry seemed to be another element. There is an anecdote recounted by Tamaro Wieselberg. It is said that Lipinski wanted to know Tartini's playing style, Tartini, who had been dead for several years, and asked Mazzorana when he met him. He was Mazzorana, one of the last pupils. And Mazzorana suggested that Lipinski read aloud some verses placed at the head of the piece, and with the resulting inspiration, Lipinski had then to perform the piece. So there wasn't only the technique being transmitted, but also a set of other variables and elements that should be explored. We already have a small amount of literature on the School of Nation, actually a very small amount of literature, but something more can certainly still be said. So thank you very much for your attention. Thanks.
Thank you so much for this fascinating paper, Cristina. I'm going to open immediately the floor if there are any questions for... Yes, Caleb.
Hopefully this is working. Okay, right after you there.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. This was really fascinating work. I'm curious if there are some interesting trends that you're starting to see coming out of working with this year, and if there's any sort of weird quirky things that popped up at the same time.
I'm going to repeat the question for you, Cristina.
Yes, because I'm not going to.
Of course, don't worry. Caleb is asking whether you have started seeing some trends in examining all these pupils. Anything that sort of like, are they coming from particular places? Are they joining the school at particular times, at particular ages, things like that?
Well, about the age, actually, is very, very difficult to trace a trend, because these are biographical information that have to be find out in primary sources, and primary sources for the most part of these pupils aren't there. So for the most part of them, we don't have anything. Actually, they aren't listed in dictionaries and encyclopedias. They are just names. For at least a half of them, they are just names. So actually, it would be natural, of course, very, very I said natürlich, sorry, I'm mixing German and English now because I'm used to speaking German, sorry. Yes, it is very, very difficult to trace trends about the age. About the origin, we have the origin. I have made another chart, a separate chart about the origin of these students. They were coming actually from Germany, France, from Java, the Isle of Java. I don't know how do you say it in English, the Isle of Java, which is very...
We understand.
We have one from Java, so it's incredible. Really, they were coming from all over Europe at the time, and even extra Europe. So, and I'm working on that. So this is actually a work in progress. You know, I didn't even put a word "and" on this work. So I think I can be more precise later on.
Yeah, no, fascinating. Yeah, I was thinking, especially at some point, you on one of your slides there was this mention of Tartini mentioning himself that at 70 he was teaching for 10 hours a day.
Oh, yes, he was complaining.
And,
yeah.
Yeah, and you know, this reminds me of so many other sources. I have in mind at this point Haydn, where that he says at some point in a letter, for a man of 73 years old to satisfy the world is impossible. And one sort of like I've done a lot of work on Haydn, and I've grown suspicion of some of the of some of the things that he says. And I was wondering, you are basically collecting all these different statements from various sources. Do you believe them all?
Well, that's another point. Thanks for this question. Yes, I'm still in the phase. I am collecting these statements, of course, and of course, we don't have to believe everything for sure. As scholars, we know that. From one point of view, he needed to have a lot of scholars. He was looking for scholars. He himself was at least in first phase when he founded School of the Nations in 1728. He was looking for scholars around Europe. So he was asking for students, and then, well, at the very end of his life, probably he was complaining he had too much, but so it's from one point of view he needed them, and from other point of view probably when he had enough, it was simply enough. And yeah.
No, the reason why I was asking is because this is a period in which being part of a school becomes of a certain importance, especially in historiography. I work a lot on the Neapolitan school, and separating fact from fiction sometimes is totally impossible. Do you know what I mean? Because it becomes part of these people, how these people and then historians validated the artistry of these musicians. So it's a very tricky business, and you're doing an excellent work, kind of like trying to map who said what when. So we are at the end of the time for your paper, but thank you so much again for your work on this. Another round of applause for Cristina. And our next speaker, it's Chiara Casarin. Chiara, are you there? Yes, wonderful.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning. So Chiara, I hope I'm saying this correctly. Are you still working on your PhD, or you finished?
Yeah. I'm still working to my PhD project at the University of Padua. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I didn't know if the biography that I managed to find was up to date. Yes, she at the University of Padua with a research project on the edition of the violin concertos for violin and orchestra by Giuseppe Tartini. She's looking particularly at the manuscript transmissions of these works. And she's among the curators, the editors of the national editions of the works by Giuseppe Tartini. She's also working on an edition of the vocal composition by Giovanni Battista Martini, and she's been selected by the Biennale di Venezia, the music subject, for a project that it's about writing about music, of which I'm a huge fan. Every project is about writing about music. I'm fascinated. But her paper today, do you want to share your PowerPoint?
Yeah, thank you.
So we can see the first slide.
Do you see it?
Yes, you can start the presentation if you want. Paper today is defining the stylistic, formal, and aesthetic conception of Tartini's violin concertos, an opportunity to reconsider Dounias. The stage is yours, Chiara. Go right ahead.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. And I would like to thank, first of all, Professor Carpenter and all the organizers of the symposium. My talk is titled Defining the Stylistic, Formal and Aesthetic Conception of Tartini's Violin Concertos, an opportunity to reconsider Dounias. The theme of Giuseppe Tartini, one of the most eclectic personalities in the 18th century European music scene, is linked on the one hand to his extensive instrumental production and on the other to the intense didactic mission that earned him the epithet Master of the Nations. Tartini mainly composes for a single instrument, the violin, and a limited number of musical genres. In addition to a small corpus of sacred and devotional vocal works, the Piranese wrote sonatas for solo violin and bass, concertos for solo violin and orchestra, for flute and cello, and finally some sonatas for 3 and 4 instruments. Among the genres experimented, however, the solo concerto holds a privileged position, partly because of the great favor enjoyed by this form in the 18th century. The experimentations made by Arcangelo Corelli, Antonio Vivaldi, Giuseppe Matteo Alberti, Tommaso Albinoni, Carlo Tessarini, and Francesco Maria Verracini are the stylistic formal models Tartini's work looks at. Nevertheless, Tartini's concertos, composed between 1721 and 1770, are in many respects unique in the 18th century musical scene. Thanks to the importance of the musical themes, the tonal structure, the cantabile nature of the melodic line, the variety of the compositional writing that characterizes the 3 periods, the different functions attributed to the orchestral forces, and the search for innovative and daring sound solutions, Tartini demonstrates his ability to grasp the legacy of past and coeval tradition and to reinterpret it into unique musical creations, even though they have not maintained a lasting reputation over the centuries. Tartini's concert output is thus an expression not only of his personality, but also of his time. It bears witness to how the first violin of Europe was involved and participated in defining 18th century culture. This paper aims to describe and contextualize from a theoretical and musical perspective the stylistic formal conception of the Tartini concerto in the early compositional period through a description of its peculiar characteristics. A better understanding of the peculiarities of Tartini's concerto thus allows us to discuss almost a century later the methodological approach of Dounias, the results achieved and the limitations of his investigations. The research develops from the critical edition work currently underway as a part of my doctoral project of 26 concertos for solo violin and string orchestra in manuscript transmission, belonging to the Tartini's first Schaffen's period. The first compositional phase is dated by the Greek musicologist Dounias in the Piran work, the Violin Concerti Giuseppe Tartini's, between 1721, the date of Tartini's employment as primo violino e capo di concerto of the Cappella Antoniana in Padua, and 1735. This corpus proves challenging in several respects. First, the impossibility of precise dating, since no manuscript has a chronological reference that allows us to date the concertos with a certainty in the long period of the composer's musical activity. Second, extremely complex sources have both different degrees of authority and multiple editorial levels. Third, the posthumous dispersal of the manuscripts in libraries, archives, and collections in Europe and the United States testifies to the alternate fortunes of the compositions. Finally, we point out the scarcity and or the incompleteness of historical evidence, both direct and indirect, that would allow for a more precise definition of certain aspects related to the violinist's work. Among the elements to be reconsidered and investigated is the performative destination of his works, the tautological prejudice of almost exclusive use and connection with the musical context of the Basilica Antoniana, a reality to which the violinist was linked almost uninterruptedly for 50 years. In short, there are several issues and open questions to be confronted when approaching the personality and the work of Tartini. While the historiographical problems listed above do not and perhaps never will allow us a complete and exhaustive view of the composer's activity, they oblige us to look for elements to approach it with a greater awareness. One of these aspects is precisely the stylistic and formal model codified by Tartini at the beginning of his long compositional career. All the concertos of the early period, except for the second concerto in B-flat major, D117, which features a solemn introduction in an imitative style, are in 3 movements. The central slow movement is framed by 2 fast movements marked by instrumental virtuosity and linked not only by a similar tempo mark, but also by the same key. However, the opening movement, differently from the concluding one, features a serious and solemn style that is reminiscent of the church style. The only composition of the early period that begins with a largo andante, followed by 2 fast movements, is the 7th concerto in A major, D94. The first and the third movements are characterized by a clear juxtaposition between the ensemble section tutti and the solo and or soli section. This separation is marked by Tartini in several ways, with a pausa that acts as a caesura, the expedient of sound amping, and the change of a register for the solo violin. In the slide, 3 examples of these ways. Tartini thus employs a ritornello structure typical of the Venetian instrumental language. Nevertheless, as Piotr Wilke notes in his monography, The Venetian Instrumental Concerto During Tartini's Time, in Tartini's approach, the ritornello form is far from the prototypes of Vivaldi. Tartini significantly redefined the role of its constituent parts, guided by different aesthetic premises. Tartini dazzles with the contrasts, surprises, and experimentation far more rarely than his predecessors. He limits the number of themes in ritornellos and relies more on reworking one or two ideas than sequencing numerous contrasting sections. He also reduced the number of keys visited, holding towards the polarized dominant tonic plans characteristic of early classical concertos. Thanks to that, these forms are quite homogeneous, transparent, and restrained in their expression. The structural core of the concerto's first movement is the solo episodes, characterized by pronounced violin virtuosity and the absolute prominence of the concertante instrument, achieved through both the high concentration of notes that make up the solist melodic line and the rarefaction of the orchestral accompaniment. The latter variously composed fulfills a dual function, on the one hand as harmonic support to the melody, on the other hand as a commentary through the reprise of conversing themes. Great attention is thus paid by the composer to the sound component, wisely and variously distributed among the parts. The solos, as already observed by Dounias, appear as autonomous creations. However, unlike in Vivaldi's coeval works, they do not have a mere linking function between two successive tutti. In Tartini, the solo sections are well integrated into the formal structure, both with regard to melody and key. As far as thematic invention is concerned, we can observe the composer's great skill in elaborating simple ideas from the notes that constitute the scale and or arpeggio of the concerto key. These musical ideas in the course of the composition are frequently reworked according to the principles of efficiency and economy of thematic materials. The use of expedients such as melodic and harmonic progressions and the repetition, whether of whole section or small fragments, also contributes to articulating and shaping the form of the composition. The second movement of the concertos of the first period deserves a separate discussion. As already found by Dounias and Elisa Grossato's research, the central movement is very short when compared to the first and third movements. However, there is a dual compositional attitude that identifies, in my opinion, two categories. The first is characterized by a juxtaposition of a tutti and solo section, which expands in terms of formal development the movement compared to the second category. The lyricism is entrusted to the concertante instrument. The melodic line is richly ornamented with embellishments clearly indicated in the score. The second category, on the other hand, includes those slow movements conceived as arias for solo violin of shorter length and often in a bipartite form, indicated through refrain signs. The real protagonist is the solo violin, which from the beginning line supported by the string orchestra, or in the case of the first concerto in B-flat major D116 by the basso continuo alone, which has the exclusive function of harmonic support. Connected to the central slow movement is, in most cases, a peculiar aspect of Tartini's production, the use of motti, as they have been named by researchers. There are short poetic fragments placed before some concerto movements that the musician uses as a compositional stimuli, as a starting point for musical composition, and which constitute a manifestation of Tartini's eclecticism. Their study, however, can be revealing of several aspects that contribute to the contextualization of the composition. An example is the motto "Spiegata ca la rete sotto le verdi fronde il cacciator s'asconde e dolce suona", in coded writing that precedes the central movement of a concerto D3, D17 for Dounias, whose literary source I have identified in the text of the aria that closes Act First of Il Climene, a drama per musica performed at the Mantica Theatre in Udine for the Carnival of 1722. The writer is not known, while the music, as it is apparent from the libretto, is by composer Giovanni Antonio Bioni, born in Venice in 1798 and died after 1739. Little biographical information is available about the Venetian musician, above all about his musical training and the production of his works in Chioggia, Ferrara, and Venice between 1721 and 1724. What arouses our curiosity, however, is the fact that Bioni was particularly active as an opera singer and composer in Prague, beginning in 1724. That is, a year after Tartini himself had arrived in the Bohemian city. In May 1724, Bioni was employed by Antonio Denzio in Venice to serve as a composer for the Peruzzi Company, which throughout the summer of that year provided opera entertainment at Cook's, the estate of Kant and music patron Franz Anton von Spork. Bioni's most important opera, Orlando Furioso, was first performed at Cook's and then performed as the opening opera for the opening of the Spork Theatre in Prague on October 23, 1724. These details thus raise many questions. How and where did Tartini come into contact with the text of an opera that experienced little fortune? It is possible to speculate that this may have been in Venice between 1722, 1723, or in Prague between 1724, 1726. Could the fact of belonging to a common musical milieu, the Venetian milieu first and the Bohemian aristocracy later, have fostered a meeting between the two musicians and led to a direct exchange of their compositions? There are questions to which it may not be possible to give a definitive answer. However, from the comparison between the Tartinian motto and the text of the opera libretto, some information can be learned. The comparison does not reveal any differences, any variance. This leads to the hypothesis that Tartini took the quotation directly from a printed version of the libretto or from the opera score instead of quoting it by heart. Another element is that the date given in the libretto stands as a terminus postquem for the composition of the concerto. The characteristics listed above can be compared with the first systematic description of the solo concerto's first movement found in the 18th century theoretical production. This is the treatise Versung einer Anweisung die Flöte Traversiere zu spielen by Joachim Quantz, dated 1752. Sorry, I have the quotation is not right, so I can read it. The first movement of the concerto requires first a ritornello full of majesty, well balanced in all parts. Secondly, it must have a graceful and intelligible melody. Thirdly, through imitations. Fourthly, the best musical ideas of the ritornello may be used to and placed among the tutti, the soli. Fifthly, it is necessary that the main part, the violin solo part, should be cantabile and accompanied by a good melody of bass. Sixthly, no greater ripieni should be created than that of the principal part. In the seventh place, the movement of the bass and of the ripieni must not reduce the liveliness of the main part, not even make it stand or silence it at all. In the eighth place, a proportionate length must be observed in the ritornello, which must be at least furnished with two main articles, which means themes, the last of which will be a content of the among most beautiful and the most majestic musical thoughts, and must be repeated at the end of the composition. In the ninth place, provided that the first musical idea of the ritornello was neither cantabile nor agreeable to the solo. A new idea absolutely opposite to the other must be invented. The author also states the superiority of the solo instrumental part, which should not be overshadowed by the orchestral accompaniment. About the conclusion of the movement, he states that it should not be rushed, but it is necessary to resolve, I quote once, with a supreme diligence and not with much haste. It is important not to introduce too many ideas near the end, but take up in the last solo section the most graceful musical themes of the movement. The last tutti should finally contain the second part of the first ritornello and conclude briefly. The description provided by Quantz fits well with the characteristics listed above, inferred from a conducted philological and analytical investigation of Tartini's concerto. It is surprising then how, a few lines after the quoted passage, the flutist addresses an unflattering word to Tartini by stating that the latter had banished from music all the good and gracious of the canto. In his music, there are almost always bland, simple and flat thoughts, which would be more congenial to the musica comica than to the musica seria. What then are the causes of these criticisms? Sergio Durante, in his monography Tartini, Padova e l'Europa, identifies two reasons. First, the purpose of Quant's treatise is to argue for the emancipation of an authentically German style rather than earlier models that, from the late 17th century onward, were based on the two tastes prevalent in Europe, the French and the Italian ones. Second, Quant's judgment was probably influenced by the opinion of some German pupils who had attended the School of Nations and exported an arguably corrupt Tartinian way of playing. A third motivation related to a form of professional competitions can be added. The first meeting between the two musicians took place, in fact, in 1723 in Prague during the celebrations for Charles VI's coronation as the King of Bohemia, thus providing a prestigious platform for gaining the attention of European aristocrats. In this context, then, the two musicians faced each other like two opponents in an all-musical arena. What is interesting to ask, however, when reading the German musicians' treatise is whether it is possible today to look at that description as a terminus ante quem for Tartini's compositions. In other words, can we employ Quant's treatise as a kind of a temporal watershed to place Tartini's concertos that reflect this description? I purposely leave the question open to set out to the conclusion and thus reflect on the work of Minos Dounias, starting from what has been said so far. The Greek musicologist is certainly credited with initiating through his pioneering work studies on the violinist by making an initial survey of the source and identifying 125 compositions. His catalogue remains to this day one of the main reference points for scholars. However, in dividing Tartini's output into 3 periods, a conventional subdivision that is most likely inspired by the late 19th century tripartition of Beethoven's artistic activity, Dounias does not take into account an aspect that influences the stylistic component of the concertos, namely their destination. Several sources link to the musician's activity to contests outside the Basilica Antoniana, from the Accademia dei Ricovrati in Padua to the Ospedale della Pietà in Venice, to private concerts he held in Venetian palaces on official visits. As an example, the electoral prince of Saxony, Friedrich Christian, during his long stay in Venice between 1739 and 1740, listened to Tartini at his residence in Palazzo Foscarini twice, on April 2 and May 10th in 1740, writing in his personal diary, the Journal du Voyage, Tardini est un retourné ici à Venise. Je l'entendis après-midi chez moi. Il joua à merveille. In the end, we wonder whether this division into periods represents a fundamental element for scholars, or instead it risks influencing them. The division and the organization into 3 periods certainly have the merit of bringing order to the vast compositional material by allowing some hypotheses to be formulated about the development of the compositional language of the author. In other words, who feels the necessity of this classification? In trying to answer this question, we cannot fail to note that this need was certainly not important for Tartini, who, unlike many contemporary composers, does not record any dates. Thank you for your attention.
You've learned to wait for me to unmute. Very, very good. Thank you so much for your paper. I'm going to open immediately the floor for questions. For Chiara, about the concerto. You can also not just ask about the specific paper, but also, if you have questions about the editions of the concertos or Tartini concertos in general, she's the person to ask. So this is your moment. Let me see if there is anyone on the chat. No. Well, I'm going to start off by asking, so you're basically suggesting or kind of like want us to reconsider the periodization of this German scholar of the, when was the book published? Remind me, 1937? Dounias.
1935.
35, yeah.
The first edition, yeah.
Yeah, and that's the first time that someone talks about Tartini's periods as 3 periods?
No, it's not. Dounias is the first scholar which theorized this tripartition of the compositional activity of Tartini. Yeah, it's the first.
Yeah, I am glad that you mentioned the Beethoven example, because it's certainly not unique to Tartini to be slotted into 3 periods at the time, and that's really kind of like a book from, if I remember correctly, 1855, Beethoven and his 3 periods, and it's more to do really with the conceptualization of especially the late period of Beethoven as something that had to be put on a different. So my question is like, what are Dounias' interest in having a 3rd period of Tartini? What does he characterize as? I haven't read lately the book, but what is for him that makes it the periods different?
I think that so the Dounias tripartition is based on stylistic elements, and so this is, in my opinion, the first problem, because it's not an objective element to consider the entire output of the composer. So I think that for Dounias, there is this necessity to give an order to this enormous corpus. The Tartini's concertos now are 170. So this is an enormous corpus, one of the most important for the period. And there is the necessity to say what is composed before or after another piece.
Understand. Yeah. Would you propose a periodization at all, or would you not? Would you? How many people? Yeah, I'm just curious. You are the person doing the edition of the Concerti. Tell us.
No, I don't want to take this risk.
All right. Maybe at the end of your PhD.
Maybe.
By the end of your PhD, you let us know if you want us to talk about 2 periods or no periods, but I'm intrigued by what you said about one periodization based on style. If you were to propose a periodization, what would you base it on?
Oh, it's an interesting question, and the answer is really, really complex. I would like to consider in my thesis also the material elements, the watermarks, and the format of the paper that the composer uses, the way in which the musical text is distributed in the different papers, that in my opinion is really relevant for characterize and define this corpus, and try to say if it's the first or the second period or the third.
Yeah, thank you so much. Absolutely fascinating. Any other question for Chiara? Otherwise, we should thank her again with another round of applause. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Session, and we are in for a lunch break. We'll back at 12:50 as per the program. So don't take more time, people. Have lunch and come back. See you soon.